Okay. What I want to deal with tonight is probably, as I've gone round the place, when I've gone round the world over the last, oh dear oh me, 35 years or more, I think, or even longer than that. The most frequent question I get asked is about John's Gospel. What's the purpose of John's Gospel? When was it written? I've been asked this question umpteen times from about 1970 onwards. Many years ago, all I used to say was, I don't know. I really don't know. I haven't got a clue. I wasn't convinced by anything I had read by anybody. And when I'm not convinced, I have to say I don't know. I had nothing else to put in its place. I didn't know. And I don't think there's any shame in saying you don't know. None of us can know the whole of the Bible. And there'll be parts of the Bible we can ask questions on. And sometimes you have to just say, I don't know. Certain particular verses, even in some of Paul's writings, think, what on earth does that mean? And I was just, I don't know. I don't know what it means. And there's no shame in that, because we can't know it all. But the purpose of John's Gospels, who actually was it written to? What was the audience that John intended it? And when was it written? When was it written? These are the two questions that people want to know. And they're not easy questions to answer, because there's quite a lot of diverse things in theology about this person's writing. But I think if you turn to John chapter 20, verses 30 to 32, I've got it on the screen here, he begins to give us some clues, because he, more than any other writer probably, explains to us the reason why he wrote. In his almost conclusion, but he goes on to write another chapter, he says, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these miraculous signs are written so that you may believe that Jesus is what? Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And so that by believing you may have life in his name. So what John was doing, he wrote this gospel, he described in detail these 8 miraculous signs so that his readers would be convinced by miraculous signs that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God. And by believing that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, they would have life in his name. Now 1 Corinthians 1 verse 22 tells us this. The Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greek looks for wisdom. If that's what the scriptures say, then really when we read John chapter 20, and he says, many other miraculous signs did Jesus, which are not written in his book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. If he's basing his argument on miraculous signs, then the likelihood is that he's writing to Jews. That he is writing to Jews. Now, Jews and miraculous signs. In Isaiah chapter 35 verses 4 to 6, Isaiah said in his prophecy, say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Your God's going to come. And when that happens, then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. That's what Isaiah said that God was going to do when he came to save his people. And if we look at the majority of miracles, the majority of healing miracles that Jesus did, they are of this type. Healing the blind, healing the deaf, healing the lame, healing the dumb. There are others written about, healing of the woman with an issue of blood and things like that. But it's quite interesting the number of times that this type of miracle is recorded, not only in John, but also in Mark, Matthew and Luke. So the Jews should have known those miraculous signs. They should have known that when God would come to save them, that these sort of things would happen. Now in Acts chapter 2 verse 12, following the miracle of the speaking in tongues, amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, what does this mean? What does this mean? The miracles to the Jews signified something. What did they mean? It meant something. It meant something. And that was their initial reaction. That was their initial reaction. The Jews on Pentecost was not, wow, fantastic, look at this. Aren't these men great? No, it was, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does it signify? And John in his gospel never used the word for miracles. He never used the words for wonders. He just used the word for signs. He always used the word for signs. Gentiles and miracles, on the other hand, was totally different. If you remember, at Lystra, Paul healed a man lame from birth. He was a pagan man. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. In other words, the pagan Gentiles did not understand miracles. To them, miracles were just fantastic things, and the people who did a miracle must have been a fantastic person. In fact, as far as they were concerned, the people who did such a miracle as this were gods, Hermes and Zeus. And we saw the same at the end of Acts, when Paul was on the island of Malta. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from Paul's hand, they said to each other, remember he gathered sticks to put on the fire, and when he was putting the sticks onto the fire, a viper came out and latched onto his hand. And they said to each other when they saw this man must be a murderer, for though he's escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. They thought it was some sort of god that could cause this to happen so that Paul would die. But Paul shook off the snake, off into the fire, and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said, what does this mean? No, they didn't. They said he was a god. They said he was a god. If you could endure a viper snake bite and have absolutely no harm, you must be superhuman. You must be superhuman. You must be a god. So, remember the people we have in the Bible. We have the Gentiles, and the Gentile pagans, and the Gentile God-fearers, and the Gentile proselytes. The pagans literally knew absolutely nothing. They did not understand God at all. They were completely indoctrinated by, if you like, Greek mythology. That was their religion. The Greek mythology was their religion. And that's how they looked at things. They looked at things through the eyes of the Greek myths. And that's what they did. The God-fearers were those Gentiles who had got fed up with the Greek temples, either because of the emptiness of the philosophy or the stupidity of the theology, or more than likely the great immorality that was associated with the Greek temples. Tremendous Greek immorality there was in those temples. And they had seen the Jews and seen how the Jews lived a very simple, honest life. That their temples, or their tabernacles, or sorry, their synagogues were very plain, very simple, and what they did in them was to sing songs, to read from some scrolls, to say prayers, and to have somebody explain what the reading was. And quite often there was quite a moral teaching in this, and a good moral teaching, so a number of the pagans started to attend regularly the synagogues, and they were known as the God-fearers. Now, some of those God-fearers took the step of becoming proselytes. That is, they decided to adopt the Jewish faith totally and completely. They became circumcised, they kept the Sabbath day, and in all intents and purposes they were treated as Jews. And quite often you'll find this expression, Jews and proselytes linked together. Jews and proselytes linked together. And this is what you get in Acts chapter 2 verse 11, I believe it is, for instance, if you want to turn there. I haven't got this one on screen. In Acts 2:11, on the day of Pentecost, he's going through a whole list of the people on the day of Pentecost. He's describing them in verse 9 as Parthians, Medes and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome. And in case we think these are Gentiles, he then says both Jews and converts to Judaism. Both Jews and converts to Judaism. And so that's what you get. These converts to Judaism were proselytes. And they were treated to all intents and purposes like Jews. So, what about the God-fearers? What about the God-fearers? They're an interesting group of people, actually. I think they're a group of people which has often been overlooked in biblical exposition. What was John trying to do? He was trying to convince his readers that Jesus was the Christ. And don't forget, the Christ means Messiah. We continually forget that. I continually forget that and have to catch myself and say he was trying to actually convince the Jews that Jesus was their Messiah. Jesus was their Messiah. And that Jesus was the Son of God. And he was doing this by detailing miraculous signs. When was he doing this? And who was he trying to convince? That's the questions we started with. When was John doing this? And who was he actually trying to convince? Well, to answer that question, I have to ask myself, what was Paul trying to do? What was Paul actually trying to do during the book of the Acts? If we go to Acts chapter 9, verses 19 to 22, this is his conversion in Damascus. And this sets a pattern of what Paul was trying to do throughout the book of the Acts. It tells us there that Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. This was following the time when he was struck blind. He was blind for 3 days. Ananias went up and laid his hands on him, and his sight was restored. Following that miracle of healing, Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus, and at once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. And those who heard him were astonished and asked, "Isn't he the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on his name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests?" Yet Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the Christ. So what Paul was doing in the synagogues was proving that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus is the Christ. Now this is exactly what John wanted to do with his gospel. It's exactly what John was doing with his gospel. And Paul was doing it in the synagogues of the dispersion. Now, to whom was Paul speaking? Well, obviously to the people in the synagogues. Who were in the synagogues? Jews and proselytes, which I can say you can look on as one group, and God-fearers. And God-fearers. Those are the people in the synagogues. John's gospel addresses the same issue as Paul does in Acts. Could John be addressing the same people then in that case? To me it looks like, I would say, a good chance that he was. Now let's just look at these God-fearers. In Acts chapter 10 verse 1, we have a number of these people who are God-fearers that we quite often just read over because we know the passages very, very well. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. So Cornelius was one of these God-fearing Gentiles. And in Luke chapter 7 verse 2, when the Lord approached a certain city there, a centurion servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." And has built our synagogue. And so you did have a number of these God-fearers who never took the step of becoming a proselyte, who never became a convert to Judaism. And as I have said, the reason for people like Cornelius and this centurion is if they had done that, the Romans would have moved them out of Judea. Because you never know, the order may come for that centurion to take his men and go and kill people. And of course, if he was a convert to Judaism, he was not likely to do that. So they didn't become converts. In Acts chapter 13 verse 26, in the first synagogue that Paul spoke on in Galatia, he says, brothers, children of Abraham, and you God-fearing Gentiles. You God-fearing Gentiles. In Acts chapter 17, verse 4 in Thessalonica, some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did the large number of God-fearing Greeks, and not a few prominent women. And in Acts chapter 17, verse 7 in Athens, so he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks. These are obviously a significant group of people. They're a significant group of people. And as I pointed out, in the years leading up to this, probably during the time when our Lord was on earth, and the Jews did attract an awful lot of Gentiles to their synagogues. So much so that many of the synagogues built during that time were built with a section at the back for the Gentiles to come into, or they had a balcony for the Gentiles to sit in, because until they become circumcised they couldn't come into the body of the hall. And I think that's the same with many synagogues still today. You can go to a synagogue, you're welcome to the Sabbath services, but you have to sit at the back. And you can't come into the body of the synagogue until you are circumcised. Now, visits to Jerusalem. Think about this. Who would go to Jerusalem? Who would go up to the feasts on those occasions? Well, the Jews and the proselytes. That's what we read about on the day of Pentecost. Having given us that huge list of people from all these different countries of the Roman Empire, he then tells us they were Jews and converts to Judaism. They were the ones that would go up to the temple. Yes, they did. That's what they wanted to do. You can imagine the proselyte wanted to go. If he was a new convert to Judaism, for the first time in his life, he would be allowed to go into the temple of Jerusalem, right into the temple, into the inner courts, because he was now circumcised. And it wouldn't surprise me, speaking after the manner of men, I have no evidence of this whatsoever at all, but if you had been a proselyte for a number of years, and then you eventually took that step to become circumcised and become a convert to Judaism, wouldn't the next thing you want to do is to go up to Jerusalem, the next group of people from your synagogue that were going up to Jerusalem to worship at the temple? I should imagine that's what you would want to do. I would anyway. But what about the God-fearing Gentiles? Would they visit Jerusalem? Well, possibly a few of them would, but I don't think many would. Why not? Because the core of going up to Jerusalem was going to the temple. And the Jews and the proselytes, yes, they could enter the temple, right into the inner courts. But the God-fearing Gentiles, most definitely not. They could not go in because they were not circumcised. They could not be circumcised. So whether many of them would want to make that trip without being able to go in the temple, possibly a few of them did, but I don't think many of them did. So, you've got some enigmas in John's Gospel. Lots of people have thought lots of things about who it's written for. And very few give a satisfactory answer to my mind, and I may not be given a very satisfactory answer to your mind. If it is written for the Jews, people ask, why are certain Jewish terms explained? If it's written for the Jews, why are certain Jewish terms explained? Because in John chapter 2 verse 6 you read, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing. Well, he wouldn't need to tell that to Jews if he was writing to Jews, people say. And in John 4:9, he writes that the things for Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Well, you wouldn't need to write that to a Jew. You certainly wouldn't write that to a Jew. But why does John put that in? Now, some people say it's written rather late, in AD 90. But if it's written after AD 70, why does it say such things as, in John 5 verse 2, now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Certainly by the time of AD 90, AD 95, there was no Jerusalem. There was no sheep gate pool, all the colonnades had been destroyed. Everything had been destroyed. So I have big problems with it written after that time. But If John was written to sort of support Paul's ministry during the Acts period, or to contact the same type of people that Paul was dealing with during the Acts period, most problems disappear. For instance, there is in Jerusalem is perfectly okay if John wrote his gospel during the Acts period. In fact, it's okay if he wrote it before AD 70. If he also wrote it to the same types of people that that Paul was dealing with in the synagogues, in other words, the Jews, the proselytes and the God-fearers, terms were explained for the benefit of the God-fearers. Because the God-fearers would not, many of them, be very fully versed with all the traditions of the people of Israel. I mean, particularly as I said, at that period of time there had been a great influx into the synagogues from the pagan world. I mean, when you go think about it, when you first were saved, or when you first started getting interested in Bible study, you know, you would hear things and you wouldn't really understand them. You wouldn't know exactly what was going on. You'd forget things. So basically, I think the terms were explained for the God-fearer. And the signs prove to the Jews, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Now, when precisely was John written? And I'm emphasis on the word precisely here. And I don't think anyone can tell. Even those people that say very clearly that John must have been written to Jews and proselytes. He must have been written to the same people that Paul was speaking to, because their ministry is exactly the same. Therefore, it must have been written during the book of Acts. Are rather vague in thinking about when it was written. And so I'm speaking humanly here. To me, after Paul returned from his first missionary journey, he had two big problems that had to be dealt with. The biggest problem he had to deal with was circumcision. The Jew, he had gone through Cyprus, he'd gone into Galatia, and he'd come back to Antioch for a rest. News reached him out of Galatia that the Judaizers, they were Christian Jews who actually said that the Gentiles had to be circumcised to be saved. They had gone behind him in Galatia and had started insisting and saying to the Gentile converts to Christianity, you are not saved. Yes, you have to believe in Jesus. Yes, you have to believe he died and rose again from the dead, but you also have to be circumcised. That's what they were saying. This problem soon hit Paul at Antioch, because the Judaizers came down to Antioch and started saying the same things there, that the Gentiles had to be circumcised to be saved. Paul couldn't win the argument at Antioch, and they sent him and Barnabas up to Jerusalem to debate it with the church in Jerusalem, with James, John, Peter and all those. And when they got to Jerusalem, they found a group of the Pharisees, who were now Christians, but they were saying that the Gentiles had to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And so the Jerusalem Council met and discussed this issue, and they decided that the Gentiles did not have to be circumcised, and they wrote a letter, and they sent the letter with Paul and Barnabas back to Antioch, and off they went. And having been back at Antioch and sorted out the issue there, they decided then to go back and visit the churches in Galatia and also tell them of the decision of the Jerusalem Council, and probably took a copy of the letter with them. They often copied things. That was one of the problems that Paul had, and by far the biggest problem. The other problem he had was that in all those synagogues that he'd gone to, in Antioch, Lystra and Iconium and all those places, there was opposition. And the opposition seems to have come to the teaching that Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus was the Son of God. That was the opposition. The Jews would not accept it, or some of the Jews would not accept it. They would not accept this teaching. We know that when our Lord was on earth, the Jews in Jerusalem, particularly the leadership, would not accept his claim that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God. They would not accept that he had the right to forgive sins. They would not accept it, totally not accept it. So the other problem Paul had was opposition to this teaching. Now the Jerusalem Council letter dealt with the circumcision issue. I like to think, and I'm emphasizing this as humanly speaking, I like to think that John's Gospel deals with the Jesus being the Christ, the Son of God issue. And if he and Paul were talking and say, well, what other problems do you have? The number 2 problem Paul had after circumcision was the fact that the Jews would not accept that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God. And the more witnesses, the more teaching, the more evidence that Paul could put to those Jews of the synagogues of the dispersion that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, the more testimonies he could have, the better. So I like to think, and I'm just saying I like to think, that after Paul had left Jerusalem and embarked on his second missionary journey, that dear old John sat down and said, I'm going to write this, I'm going to write this, and actually, put my case for Jesus being the Christ, the Son of God. And this is my document. So I see John being written before Acts 28:28. One of the reasons I think it must have been written before then is because I think John had died by that time. And I need to look at John's death. One of the documents you have in the Antiquities of the Jews, which is written by Josephus, in the book 20, chapter 19, paragraph 1, it says, the high priest Ananus the younger, a Sadducee, assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So James, the Lord's half-brother, was stoned in Jerusalem, and this occurs about the same time Paul got to Rome, in Acts chapter 28. Now, this is what B.W. Bacon writes in The Making of the New Testament. One of the traditions of the Jerusalem elders, reported by Papias, declared that John was killed by the Jews in fulfillment of the Lord's prediction, and this earlier tradition must be accepted in spite of its conflict with one which has gradually superseded it. The earliest tradition about John's death was that he died in Jerusalem in about AD 62. He was stoned to death with James, the Lord's half-brother. However, another tradition arose, and the second tradition arose that John actually did not die of martyrdom, but lived on to old age